He offered her $50,000 to pretend to be his fiancée for one weekend, just one weekend, to convince his dying mother he'd finally settled down before she passed. Renee stood in his kitchen, still wearing her cleaning uniform, staring at the check he'd already written out with her name on it. And she did something Franklin Whitmore had never once experienced in his 46 years of being one of the wealthiest men in Charleston. She said no. Before we continue, if you believe a person's dignity is worth more than any amount of money, and that real love only grows from real respect, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to this channel. Stories like this remind us that the right person was never trying to buy you in the first place. Renee had been cleaning houses in Charleston's wealthiest neighborhoods for almost 6 years, ever since her husband passed away suddenly from a heart attack at 34, leaving her with 2 young children and a mortgage she had no idea, at the time, how she was going to keep paying. She built her small cleaning business one house at a time, one careful, trustworthy reference at a time, until she had a steady roster of clients who genuinely valued her work. Franklin Whitmore's mansion had been on her client list for just over a year. He'd inherited a real estate empire from his father, expanded it considerably through his own sharp instincts, and become, by his mid-40s, one of the most quietly wealthy men in the entire state, though almost nobody outside his own circle would have guessed it from how he actually lived. He wasn't flashy. He drove an older car. He wore the same worn leather jacket to run errands. But the house itself, the properties, the holdings, told a very different story from the man who occupied them. Renee cleaned his house every Tuesday and Friday, always careful to work efficiently around his schedule, rarely exchanging more than a polite greeting when their paths crossed. Franklin barely registered her presence during those first several months, the way wealthy men sometimes fail to register the people who quietly keep their entire lives functioning smoothly around them. That changed slowly, almost without either of them noticing at first. Franklin began coming home earlier on the days she worked, finding small reasons to be in whatever room she happened to be cleaning. He noticed things about her he hadn't expected to notice, the careful, deliberate way she worked, never cutting corners even in rooms he rarely used. He noticed she always left a small bowl of water on the back porch for a stray cat that wandered through his property, feeding an animal that wasn't hers with money she clearly didn't have to spare. He noticed, one afternoon, that she'd stayed nearly an hour past her scheduled time, unpaid, simply to help his elderly housekeeper Dolores finish a task her arthritis had made increasingly difficult, refusing the extra payment Dolores tried to offer her from her own pocket afterward. Franklin's own life, beneath the wealth and the property holdings, had grown quietly hollow over the years. His fiancée had left him 8 years earlier, just months before their wedding, choosing a man with a flashier lifestyle and a more visible social profile, a betrayal that had left Franklin guarded and increasingly isolated ever since. He surrounded himself with business associates who wanted something from him and family members who mostly wanted the same thing, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped believing anyone approached him without some kind of angle. Then his mother, Eleanor, was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer, given only a few months to live by doctors who spoke carefully and without much hope. Eleanor's dying wish, stated repeatedly during her hospital visits, was simple and devastating in its simplicity. She wanted to see her son settled before she passed, married or at least seriously committed, tired of watching him build an empire while remaining entirely, deliberately alone. Franklin panicked in a way his considerable wealth had never once prepared him for. He couldn't manufacture a genuine relationship in the handful of weeks his mother realistically had left. And in a moment of desperate, poorly considered logic, he thought of Renee, someone trustworthy, someone he'd quietly come to respect over the past year, someone who could plausibly play the role convincingly enough to give his mother the peace she was asking for before she died. He wrote the check before he even fully thought through what he was asking. $50,000, enough to pay off the remainder of Renee's mortgage entirely, enough to change her family's entire financial situation, In exchange for one weekend of pretending, meeting his mother, playing the part of a devoted fiancé long enough to give a dying woman some measure of peace. If you've ever been offered something that seemed too good to refuse, but knew in your gut that accepting it would cost you something you couldn't ever get back, tell us in the comments, because what Renee did next changed the entire course of Franklin's life in ways his money never could have managed on its own. Renee looked at that check for a long moment, standing in his enormous kitchen still wearing her cleaning uniform, her hands still slightly damp from scrubbing his countertops. She thought about her children, about the mortgage payments that sometimes kept her awake at night, about how completely that single check could change everything about her family's future. Then she set the check down on the counter, gently, and looked directly at Franklin. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Whitmore," she told him quietly. "I understand you're desperate, and I understand your mother is dying, and I'm truly sorry for that. But pretending to love someone, even for a weekend, even for money that would genuinely help my family, isn't something I'm willing to do. Your mother deserves better than a lie in her final months. And honestly, so do you." She picked up her cleaning supplies and left for the day, the check still sitting untouched on his kitchen counter. Franklin stood there for a long time after she left, stunned in a way he genuinely couldn't remember experiencing before. He had offered people money for far smaller favors throughout his entire career, and it had never once, not a single time, been refused. Renee's rejection sat with him for days, turning over in his mind in ways he couldn't fully explain even to himself. He started paying closer attention after that, not with any particular plan, simply unable to stop noticing the woman who had refused $50,000 without a single moment of visible hesitation. He learned, through careful, respectful conversation rather than assumption, that her younger son Isaiah had a learning disability requiring expensive specialized tutoring she could barely afford. He learned that she hadn't taken a single day of real rest in 6 years, working through illness, through exhaustion, through every hardship life had handed her since her husband's death. He found her one afternoon sitting alone in his kitchen during her lunch break, quietly crying over a tutoring invoice she clearly couldn't cover that month. He asked what was wrong, and though she initially tried to wave it away, she eventually admitted the truth, embarrassed and exhausted in equal measure. Franklin offered to help cover the cost. Renee immediately refused, reminding him firmly that she wasn't interested in charity any more than she'd been interested in his earlier proposal. Franklin told her, gently but firmly, that this wasn't a transaction, that he wasn't asking for anything in return this time, that sometimes people simply deserved help without strings attached. Renee still refused, but something in that refusal had softened slightly, the beginning of a trust neither of them had expected to find between them. Franklin quietly arranged, through Isaiah's school directly rather than through Renee, for a portion of the tutoring costs to be covered through what he described as an educational scholarship fund, careful to remove himself entirely from the transaction so Renee would never feel indebted to him personally. When she eventually discovered what he'd done, weeks later, she confronted him, frustrated but undeniably moved by the quiet, careful way he'd handled it. Their relationship shifted slowly, genuinely, over the following months, built entirely on conversations that had nothing to do with money or desperation or dying mothers. Franklin found himself, for the first time in nearly a decade, actually looking forward to Tuesdays and Fridays, to conversations in his kitchen that had nothing to do with business or obligation. Eleanor's health continued declining, and with only weeks remaining, Franklin finally worked up the courage to bring Renee to meet her properly, not as a paid performance, but as someone he had genuinely, carefully come to care for. He was honest with his mother about everything: the initial desperate offer, Renee's refusal, the months that had followed, the real relationship that had slowly, unexpectedly grown from that refusal. Eleanor, weak but sharp-eyed even in her final weeks, looked at Renee for a long moment before speaking. "You turned down $50,000 from my son," she said quietly. "That tells me more about your character than any amount of money ever could have." Eleanor passed away 3 weeks later, peacefully, having spent her final days genuinely getting to know a woman whose integrity had ultimately given her more comfort than the desperate lie her son had originally proposed ever could have. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to remember that real love is never something that can be purchased, and subscribe for more stories that remind us dignity is worth more than any check anyone could write. Franklin and Renee's relationship continued growing steadily in the months following Eleanor's passing, built on a foundation that had nothing to do with the desperate proposal that first brought them into real conversation. He never once brought up money again in a way that made her feel like anything other than an equal. She never once let his wealth change who she fundamentally was, still cleaning several of her original clients' houses for over a year after their relationship became public, unwilling to let anyone assume she'd simply been waiting for a wealthy man to rescue her. Nearly 2 years after that first refused check, Franklin proposed to Renee properly, in his own kitchen, the same room where she'd once set his desperate offer down untouched. This time, there was no check involved, no desperate timeline, no dying mother's wish to fulfill. There was simply a man who had learned, slowly and genuinely, what it actually meant to be loved by someone who had never wanted anything from him at all. Renee said yes, not because it changed her financial situation, though it certainly did, but because somewhere in those 2 years, Franklin had become someone worth saying yes to, entirely separate from anything his wealth could offer her. And before we go, tell us in the comments, would you have taken that $50,000, or would you have refused it the way Renee did, even knowing what it might have meant for your family's future? Sometimes the most valuable thing a person can offer isn't money at all. Sometimes it's simply refusing to compromise who you are, even when the price being offered would change everything about your circumstances. Renee never once set out to change Franklin Whitmore's life. She simply refused to be purchased, and in doing so, she taught a man who had everything exactly what it actually meant to be loved for who he was, rather than what he could provide.